If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. On the podcast, I want us to think about our productivity as knowledge workers. And there's been a lot of work done to get us to this point. And as we're thinking about our own productivity going forward, I want to go back and understand a little bit of the history and the trajectory of knowledge that brought us to where we are now. And I think that will help us as we understand what our question is, what work's already been done on it, and therefore what we need to do in order to move this whole study forward a little bit. So we're going to talk about the history today of knowledge work productivity. It's going to involve a lot of different names, as history does. And what I call the triumvirate, well, actually, it's the quadrumvirate. That's actually the real word. Here we are. The Mount Rushmore of modern productivity thinking. And again, it's only through understanding what they were thinking about can we extend that thinking. And then we can work on knowledge work productivity and really understand where we're at and what it is we're trying to do, and maybe get some examples of the work that needs to be done going forward. So who are we going to talk about? Well, we go all the way back to the start of the 20th century. We have Frederick Taylor, and he's studying what was called scientific management, which is interesting because it's a study of work, not of management per se, not of management as we understand it now. And then mid-century and coming forward, we've got Peter Drucker. And he's important because he was doing all the thinking around knowledge work and how that came about. He actually foresaw the rise of knowledge work all the way back to the late 50s. And then coming forward even a little bit more, we've got Stephen Covey. And he really changed the way we thought about how to get our mindset right in order to be effective people. And what he wrote, we may be a little jaded now in the productivity world and in productivity literature, but what he wrote was really different than what came before him. And we'll talk about how that worked. All the way into now the 21st century and the early part in the aughts, David Allen wrote a book that taught us how to use tools, modern tools, and stop using our brains for task and attention management. So he was the first one in my mind really to get practical about, okay, here's what we do in order to begin to solve this problem that we all face. Now, even more recently, you'll hear me bring in thoughts from people like Cal Newport and a guy named Thomas Davenport and all these different kinds of names. But there's lots of, like any study, there's lots of different people, lots of different moving parts. But anyway, Drucker, Covey, Taylor, and David Allen. So what are we really thinking about when we think about improving our productivity? And it really boils down to what problem do business people and managers in particular have to deal with? And this is knowledge worker productivity. So why is it an important problem? What ways have we tried to deal with it previously? What tools have been developed and put at our disposal to try and solve it now? And who else besides me might be currently presenting solutions? And what are those solutions that are being presented so that we're not having to go all the way back to the beginning and recreate from scratch? Now, the fundamental issue is that our economy, and particularly our economic productivity, is in the process of changing It started a while back, a little more recently. It might be that we're actually coming to some sort of a climax, and I'll explain what that is. But it changed from the model of productivity growth that we had throughout the majority of the 20th century, and it changed over into a new model of productivity growth. And we'll talk about a little bit about why that's important. The notion of productivity growth is, according to Drucker, foundational in the overall success of our economy. In other words, what drove our overall economic success in the 20th century, according to Drucker, was the productivity of manual labor. And so we learned to build factories, and we learned to build robots, and we learned for people to do work in ways that made their work much, much more effective, and thus made the products cheaper, and thus put us all in a position where we're economically wealthy. Now, we've done that. Okay, we're kind of post manual labor in our society, and that's the change I referred to in the introduction. So now here we are. Now, how do we study this problem? And that's really interesting, because we're looking at organizational structures in the economy. We're looking at businesses. Now, the interesting part about that is studying business is really a social science. It's really akin to anthropology and history and those kinds of ideas, as compared to some sort of an engineering thing that we try to do. Now, there's debate about that point. And we spent some time in the 1990s trying to engineer business processes. And some will say that processes that are in a computer are engineered processes. And we can talk about that. In fact, that might be good fodder for another post, so look for that in the future. But what we want to focus on now is this notion that business, at least up to this point, has not been engineered in the sense of that we normally think of engineering. So nobody sat down with a model of a business and said, okay, business needs to be structured this way. Business is more organic, more businesses grow the way societies grow, the way groups or teams of people grow, and it's different. So the point of all that is that we have to go back and seek to understand how these business structures develop to get to the point where they are today, and to produce the productivity that we now enjoy, so that we can see what happened and how we might replicate it going forward. But the point is that we can't sit back and make models like engineers do of a bridge and then go build the thing. So when we look back at the original, and we're going back to history now, if we look back at original organizational structure, we've got government bodies, church, and military. And this is back to, let's just say, the 1600s or something like that. And the model of organization management of governance, right, which means how do we as a leader govern our organization? And how do we help people behave in ways that supports the organization? Much like the government of the United States is intended to help us behave in ways that we all support each other as the United States. So it was monarchy and hierarchy. And that's still really a practiced organizational structure. But that's all we knew how to do. We didn't know other ways to do it, because that's the way the government was organized. That's the way the church, and when I say the church, I mean mostly the medieval church, the Catholic Church, and then military. They're all very hierarchical and very top-down driven. So here we are, and we're just beginning to come out of the dark ages, and we're just beginning to do business. And there's this craftsman model, and things are built, made, if you will, as one single after a blacksmith would make horseshoes. So he'd go all the way from kind of getting the iron all the way up to building horseshoe. And the way that was structured was under a monarchy. And so what I think we now know about this is that there wasn't trade and business the way we think of business. In other words, originally the blacksmith didn't sell the horseshoe to anybody. The blacksmith came and he worked for the king. And so the king would say, hey, blacksmith, Farmer Brown over there, his horse needs a shoe, so build him a horseshoe, put that on his horse, would you? And I'll make sure, I, the king, will make sure that you get some of his produce. And so everything, all of that economic function kind of went through the monarch is the model that I think we now understand. And that's great, but central control of an economy has problems. And so, what do you do if, I think my horse needs a shoe and the king disagrees? Does my horse go barefoot? Or do I find some other way to incentivize the blacksmith to make me a horseshoe? And if we're doing that, then maybe I'm growing corn and he's got a way to use a little extra corn. And I say, hey, look, let me give you a little corn. You give me a horseshoe. Everybody's happy. And the king's just kind of out of the picture. Well, you can see how this then would have evolved into what we now understand as trade and market economy and these kinds of ideas. So everybody is trying to do well in their business, okay? And trying to be wealthy, for lack of a better term. Even people who worked for kings were trying to, climb the hierarchy and have more stuff and prettier clothes and different things like that. And so all of these things were going on, and we humans are very inventive about solving these kinds of problems. And so we developed things like trade and barter and these kinds of ideas. Now, about this same time, the kings realized that they needed to get things from people who weren't their direct subjects. And so they developed ways of doing that by owing people, and they would pay them out of their treasuries eventually. And so these different things happen. And that had something to do, and I won't get into the whole history, but that had something to do with the emergence of money and of banking. So all of this is emerging as problems are solved. It's not designed, is the broader point. It just kind of happened. It kind of grew up as people invented solutions, and then solutions worked and other people adopted those solutions, and business organizations are emerging. We're in this model where people went to work as an apprentice. So if you wanted to be a blacksmith, and it's not quite that simple, but we'll just stick for that for now. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you would apprentice to a blacksmith, and the blacksmith would teach you his trade. And then for a while, you would work to make the blacksmith more money because he'd spent time and effort training you. And then at some point, you'd ease off into your own blacksmith practice in another town or under another king or whatever that looked like. You probably would not move to the other side of town and become a blacksmith, because that most towns didn't need two blacksmiths. On the other hand, certainly there were people at the time, and this is obvious in hindsight, certainly there were people at the time who said, well, I could go do my own blacksmithy thing in another town, but, I've kind of, decided that I'd like to get married to that person over there who lives here, and families are here. And so I kind of want to stay here. So how about I just continue to work in your blacksmith shop? So you trained me, so I'm going to continue to work in your blacksmith shop. And together we'll be able to make more horseshoes, and we'll figure out some way to split the profits. Well, now we're beginning to get organizations. And once you've got two or three people working in this whole business of deciding who's going to build horseshoes versus who's going to build plows, and how that's going to work out, and what's the allocation of labor, and who's going to get paid what for what, and all this sort of thing, that becomes this problem of management. So now we've got this structured management that's beginning to happen. And again, it's very hierarchical at this point. In any event, at this point, regardless of how many people there were, they all worked for the king. And so that's how wealth got distributed. And then, as I said before, maybe some side deals happened and a little bit of barter happened and people got horseshoes without the king knowing about it, because it's kind of a headache for the king. And so some stuff's going to go on behind the scenes. And again, the point is that all of this just more or less occurred. It occurred. It's a response to people's behavior rather than people sitting down and going, hey, what would be the best way to organize people? Let's theorize about that, because we didn't have the science. So we just, here we hauled off. And again, you get 3 blacksmiths, you got a managerial problem. And there isn't hard science to handle this. In comparison, when we went to build the atom bomb, for example, it became apparent from theoretical physics that such a thing was possible, that atoms behaved in ways, or we could put atoms in situations where they would produce lots of energy. And that became obvious from theory. So then we engineered a way to build one. There was experimentation that went on, but not at any scale. But we used models, and we used physics, and we used engineering to create this thing that we, at the time, felt we needed. And that's a very different way. That's the engineered, constructed model of an artifact, and organizations did not grow that way. Same idea with NASA launching rockets to the moon. It became obvious that it was theoretically possible. And then when John F. Kennedy was president, it became desirable for us to put somebody on the moon. And so we got a bunch of smart people together and said, okay, let's do the math, let's use the science, let's develop this rocket, let's get people to the moon and get them back, and we'll solve this problem, but we'll create a solution rather than just experimenting our way to get there. So business is growing, it's growing organically. The governance of business, i.e. management, is growing organically. And then some real interesting businesses started to happen that posed yet another managerial problem. So the first managerial problem is, how do you allocate labor and effort? And how do you get people to work rather than take naps? So we've been working on that, and that's handled via some sort of hierarchical, monarchical, leader first model. The boss tells everybody what to do. And then a couple of businesses happened that were technology based, and I have in mind the railroad and the telegraph. So this produced another management problem, and the problem is distributed locations for workers. Railroads are valuable because they move things long distances relatively cheaply and quickly, relatively. And that situation puts the railroad in a position where it's going to have a bunch of people at one place, and then it's going to have a long railroad track without many people, and then it's going to have a bunch of people at the other place. So say these are towns 30 miles apart. Well, the interesting problem then that railroad has to solve is, how do you coordinate effort between 2 locations that are 30 miles apart? And maybe this requires a little bit of thought in our mind because we're so used to having, modern communication, but there was no mode of communication that was any faster than the train itself. So if you needed to tell the station 30 miles away that the train was going to be an hour late, so not have the workers come and have to pay them for an extra hour, there was no way to get it there faster than to put a letter on the train. And so at about this same time, roughly, at about the same time, the telegraph was invented, which improved communications and helped out greatly. And we've still got this problem of managing somebody that you can't directly see. So management at a distance. This is another managerial problem that we developed to try to solve. And, we see between the telegraph and the railroad, the history of information and the history of business and cultural growth are really heavily intertwined. So the telegraph happened, and then businesses reacted and learned how to use that to help things happen at distances. So we've got both larger organizations with more people, and we've got locations in multiple locations for the same business, places that we have to deal with people. And this was organic growth. This was problem solving. This was learning by example. And quite frankly, business might be more Darwinian than Darwin ever thought it'd be, because only the profitable businesses survive. So it's really interesting to see these models emerge and then get taken up because they are, quote, the most successful, unquote, and get used broadly. And then all of this really was command and control. So we're at a point now, and this might be, let's say it's late 1800s, around maybe the turn of the 20th century. So we're seeing larger organizations, and we see some work better and some work worse, but it very much, the success of the business is challenged at every turn. And if the business is not a financial success, then the business is going to not be a business. So we've got to get better at doing this business thing. And one of the things that we have to figure out is this whole notion of leadership and governance. And it's about who gets to tell who what to do, and how does how does the leader make those ideas stick with people? Our first idea here, and this is what was the thought around the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, was there's a great man that the person who grew to be the leader of an organization was simply, for unexplained reasons, a great human being, had talent, gifted by God, whatever, luck. But if you got to be the owner of a huge organization, then people listen to you because you are a great human being. And that then became the governance model, is, well, you have to listen to me because I'm a great human being. And it wasn't probably said exactly that way, but that was everybody's mindset, is, wow, I need to listen to him because he's got authority and he built this company. And so, I can learn and I'll do it his way just because, he's a great man. So that continued to go. Now, at this time, the first half of the 20th century, organizations are going from medium-sized to really huge. And businesses, that is, because armies had been huge previously, and were managed in particular ways, which we won't slow down for right now. But we're getting these huge corporations. And one of the things that fueled the growth of corporations was the notion of selling stock. And stock was sold to raise dollars, that is capital, so that further investment could be made, so there'd be cash to expand the factory and build more cars, whatever's going on. And the big corporations like GM at the time were selling stock for capital purposes. And again, this is something that was not engineered, something nobody sat back and go and used the principles of physics to develop the notion of stock ownership. It just sort of emerged and happened, and there's a history of that. But what happened is we had stock out there running around. And then, you may be aware, in the late 20s and early 30s, we had this thing called the Great Depression, which happened in large part because the stock market crashed. And ever since then, economists have been focused on one primary goal, which is make sure that doesn't happen again. And so government then is now involved in regulating what's going on. And so now government is saying, hey, we've got to understand how this business thing works and explain it to people. So there's a lot of effort and energy then put into understanding how this works. Government's interested, people that want to get rich, which everybody is interested. We're starting to have study of this sort of thing. So now here we are, we've talked a little bit about what happened in the 20th century. And we'll talk about it some more. But we want to stop here at the beginning of the 20th century because this really fascinating thing happened as businesses. We were trying to learn about business and how to do business. Because the notion of efficiency was beginning to happen. And this sort of goes all the way back to Adam Smith and economics, but really practical efficiency, in my mind, began with Frederick Taylor. And he was doing his thing really in the early 1900s. And here we are, and factories at this point were running on steam, which is interesting because the moving things were steam engines. And we weren't building cars in factories yet. So Henry Ford hadn't happened yet. And he's important, but more from the business side. We were running on steam, and so the motors were steam motors. And so the way a factory worked is you had a big steam boiler and you had steam pipes running to all the individual machines, and that steam would be what would turn the motor and make the machine work. And that got to be a situation because you got this big boiler, and one of the jobs then in the factory is to make sure that the boiler's got coal in it so that the fire stays hot so we don't run out of steam and the machines don't stop moving. And one of the big deals, the reason I tell that story, is because one of the things that Frederick Taylor studied was that level of productivity. It's referred to as scientific management, but the goal was, Taylor said, well, let's not leave it a mystery. Let's study how people do what they do. And based on that study, let's see if we can find some inefficiencies and recommend different ways to do it. And to totally oversimplify what Taylor figured out, because it's easy to do it that way, one of the things he figured out is if you're shoveling heavy, dense stuff, you need to use a small shovel. And if you're shoveling light, not less dense stuff, then you need a bigger shovel. And that way you're moving kind of the same amount of weight all the time, and you can do it more efficiently and more effectively. Because if you use a snow shovel to move iron pellets, then it's going to be hard to lift the shovel. So that's really what was going on. But that was one of his results. But what he really was doing was he was showing us that it's okay and that it's profitable to study efficiency and to study how people do work. And then we can begin to explain it. So he showed us how to do that, because prior to that, it was something of a mystery. It's like, well, we know some people are better than others, but we can't explain why, right? Kind of back to the great man theory. So we got Taylor, and he's taking jobs apart and trying to understand their components and then putting them back together, it becomes engineering at this point, or he's trying to make it into engineering. But it's explaining human performance and trying to improve it. Now, we move forward to the 30s and 40s. Peter Drucker wrote a book called The Concept of the Corporation. And the interesting thing about the concept of the corporation is that Drucker is trying to explain how a corporation works. So we know that there's these huge, like GM, and in fact, he studied GM. There's these huge businesses, and some do better than others. And we all are interested, because again, we all want to get wealthy. We're all interested in why one's better than another. And the government's interested in all these different things. And so Drucker then is trying to say, well, here's how General Motors works. Here's why it's a good company, a good organization. And this is how General Motors goes about getting people to work together. So now we're taking the organizational structure and beginning to study it. And there are other names. It's not just Drucker. If you study this history, Chester Barnard, is a guy that also was studying this idea of a corporation. And there were others, but Drucker really the concept of the corporation, and he put that together. So now we're starting the formal study of large business organizations. We've got to produce a lot, and so we've got to break down the production because no one person can produce it all. And how do we go about doing that? And how do we go about designing the jobs? And how do we go about explaining the job to a person so that a person can do it? And how do we go about motivating people? And it's not a formal analytical technique like in a lab. We have formal analytical techniques for, say, chemistry. And we can use those analytical techniques to break down a substance and explain what it is. Well, we don't have that in business. So Drucker then is developing technique for management and the ideas of knowledge work. So that's what's happening with him. So Taylor's down at the worker level saying, okay, well, we can do work better. And Drucker's at the organizational level saying, well, we can manage better. And so we're beginning to understand these things and study these things. So now we kind of get up, and Drucker managed, his writing went all throughout the second half of the 20th century. And we're still trying to explain this notion of leadership. And we're still trying to explain how good managers manage and how good organizations are built. And so in the 80s, Stephen Covey comes along. Now, Covey was an academic and, of course, is famous for writing The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He's not actually studying business, except sort of sideways, right? If you study fish, you got to know something about water. Well, Covey's studying people, and if you're studying people then and their effectiveness, then you got to know something about business. But he's exploring this idea of effectiveness. And so we still are in a little bit of a problem because we don't yet know how to explain this. Now, people before Covey explained it, he calls their explanations the personality ethic. And so we had kind of gotten over into, well, if you glad hand a lot of people and, tell them what they want to hear, and this kind of Machiavellian manipulation thing was kind of this idea of the personality ethic. It's a little harsh, but that's just to paint a picture of where Covey was on this. And he really attacked that notion pretty hard. And Covey came back and he said, okay, well, personal effectiveness is really important if you're going to be a manager in an organization. It's also important if you're going to be a worker, but it's probably a little easier because you get told what to do. And as a leader of an organization, you need to be personally effective. Now, he's starting to try to explain how this works. That's not the personality ethic. And so Covey talks about effective people in terms of psychological and social properties of behavior and patterns of thought. For example, he says, effective people begin with the end in mind. And that's a mode of thought that, according to Covey, and I think we all largely agree, successful people do have a goal in mind before they start working. Effective people is the term Covey used, of course. So Covey refers to Drucker a little bit, and there, Drucker's working at it from the explaining how business works situation, and oh, by the way, you got to know people if you're going to study business. And then Covey is primarily studying people, but if you're studying effective people, then most effective people are in some sort of an organization, typically business. So that's where the overlap comes from. And Covey came later, so he does refer to Drucker a little bit in his writings, and seems to have been influenced by some of Drucker's thinking. And this appears not in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but in a book Covey wrote called The 8th Habit, and this one got published in 2004. So now, all of this gets us up to 2000, right? And we know, because Drucker told us, we know that All of this is turning into knowledge work and a knowledge economy. And of course, we can see it happen all around us by the turn of the 21st century. We know that information management is huge. We're working with our heads much more than we're working with our hands. And so Drucker's hypothesis is that we made great economic strides as a society in the 20th century, largely because we made manual labor more productive. Now he's seeing this shift to knowledge work, and he's saying, okay, now we've got to make knowledge work more productive, because currently we don't really understand how knowledge work works. We don't have a clear grasp of how problem solving works. And so we're studying that, and that's what we're doing. Okay. Now, the primary alternative model to Drucker's hypothesis, which is great managers make great organizations. That's roughly his hypothesis. Okay. And great managers need to help knowledge workers figure out how to be better knowledge workers, and that's what a manager does. So that's Drucker's hypothesis about business performance. The other primary hypothesis is the strategic hypothesis. And there's a thing in business school, an MBA kind of school that came out of Harvard. It's called the SCP paradigm. And that means structure, conduct, performance. And the notion of the SCP paradigm is that, much like in a sporting contest, say a football game, you analyze the situation and you analyze the defense, and then based on what you understand to be the weaknesses of the defense, you call a play, and you're successful because you understood a weakness in the situation that you could exploit. Well, that's roughly the structure, conduct, performance model of business. So we look at the structure of the industry, we go, oh, our industry needs somebody doing that right there. Let's move in that direction. That's the conduct. And then performance is the result. Now, Drucker didn't think that was a great idea, a great way to manage business, because it was competitive within the industry versus overall growth to some degree. So here we are, and he's saying it, oh, it's knowledge work, guys. Figure out how to do knowledge work. And now we look back at Drucker, and he was absolutely right, because we look around at what we do in 2025, and everybody I know, more or less, is a knowledge worker. And I know a few people that work in factories, but even then, they're like maintenance techs and engineers and people. But Drucker identified it, and he's saying that's what's important for business to figure out. Don't worry too much about the strategizing, worry about the managing, and worry about making people better. So now we've moved on to knowledge work and management of knowledge workers. And our question now is, how do we manage ourselves and others in this environment? So the first thing is, what's the goal of management? And according to Drucker, and I agree with him, the goal of management is to improve the productivity of knowledge work. Allocate resources such that we get better at knowledge work, and thus we get more productive as a society, and then we continue to grow in our wealth rather than stagnate. So now here we are, and we're up to about 2005. Okay, so David Allen now comes on the scene, and he goes, okay, well, we've got to get intangible work done. Now, David Allen did not do a whole bunch of history and theorizing about that I've just walked through. He just looked at the situation and he said, hey, I'm a consultant. I see a lot of people struggling with this thing. Here's a system I've developed. If you put it into place, you'll get more success out of it and less stress. Okay, and he called his system the Getting Things Done system, and he wrote a book by that name, Getting Things Done. And GTD was all the rage among people who wanted to try and be more effective and more successful. So if you read Covey, there was a pretty good chance that you would also read David Allen, even though it was 15 or 20 years later. So those of us who are knowledge workers in our career look at our situation and we go, okay, how do I get better so that I can produce more value so that I can make more money? Still wanting to get rich. So we feel that we need to understand knowledge work and become a good manager of knowledge work. If for no other reason than knowledge workers really wind up managing themselves. And I've explained this elsewhere, but we have to figure out how to help people do this in order for our organizations to be improving in productivity for knowledge work. In my career, a large chunk of my career was managing programmers, and I thought a lot about, okay, how do we make programmers more effective? How do we help them produce more value for our organization so that our organization runs better? And thus, value is created and it's shared back down into the people in the organization. So this is our problem, and this is what we're trying to set up and what we're trying to do. And that's the history of why we're doing it. And so the reason I went all the way back to Frederick Taylor is because his success in the creation of scientific management was all about going back and looking very carefully at the work people did and how they went about doing it and breaking it down into its components and then trying to do some systems thinking about the entire piece of work. And David Allen, to some degree, perhaps accidentally, if I ever talk to him, I'll ask him, came up with this way of doing information management, which is a foundational part of knowledge work. Mm-hmm. And so David Allen developed these processes for managing information. As knowledge workers, our personal information is a huge asset. Our knowledge, our learning, if you're an engineer, you have some books of equations on your shelf, so you go find them. And your ability to find the right equation quickly has something to do with your productivity. So that's information management. So we're trying to work here. And so Taylor really launched the productivity of labor by developing what got called scientific management and really working that way. And so I would suggest that that's what we need to do is we need to take David Allen, and David Allen's stuff works. A lot of people will tell you that the GTD mindset really helped them, in fact, to get things done. And we've got a whole productivity industry out there that's telling us how to get better at really knowledge work. I would suggest that nobody has gone back and done the work that Taylor did for manual work. Nobody's done that for knowledge work. And David Allen got the closest. Now, getting things done methodology had one foundational problem, which is it never really made the leap to computers. And it was developed and built at a time when one could still effectively manage with paper. Those days are gone, in my opinion. And so now what we're doing is we're bringing that GTD methodology forward, and it's changed and morphed into now what I call the attention compass process. So in this way, we've broken down the steps of knowledge work, and we've put them into a toolkit that has all the advantages of electronic storage, and there are many, versus paper. And thus we're able to make our knowledge work more effective, or at least remove waste from our knowledge work process. So back to our example of an engineer. Every minute that the engineer spends flipping through books trying to find the right equation to use, every additional minute beyond the minimum required is wasted work. Much like a craftsperson looking for the chisel that they need. Oh, it was here somewhere. Well, they're not changing the wood while they're looking for the chisel. And so if we can help them organize and find the chisel immediately, then we've helped their work in the same way. With knowledge workers, if we can help them find their information, not waste time searching for it. And so that's where personal information management feeds in. And that's where attention compass is really strong. So all of this to say, if we're looking at knowledge worker productivity, that's where attention compass is focused. And to some degree, David Allen was the one that took apart the personal information management work and put it in components and helped us understand how to do it better. And again, his process never really took advantage of the properties of modern information management tools. And that's what attention compass brings in. So attention compass is intended to attack this knowledge worker productivity problem. So if you're a knowledge worker and you're worried about getting better at what you do, I suggest that you take a look at attention compass, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that. And then the underpinning theoretical, if you will, idea of attention compass is it's based on thinking that's similar to what Frederick Taylor did. And that's why I have confidence that it will help us address this knowledge worker productivity problem, because I'm using the same kind of model that Frederick Taylor used in the 1900s that was so successful that we kept doing it for the better part of a century. We kept breaking work down and trying to re-engineer it. And so that's where attention compass comes in. We've effectively broken down this idea of knowledge workers and personal information management. We've put it back together with modern toolkit in such a way that it works better. We find information more quickly. We waste less of our primary productive resource, which is our attention. And we're able to get more work done, create more value, be better, and make a stronger contribution in our careers, and thus get a greater share of the profits and money involved in all. So yes, we're trying to get better at what we do. We're trying to become better knowledge workers so that we can A, make more money, or B, spend less time working. And in both cases, C, lower our stress around the amount of things that we need to deal with. All that to say, that's the bigger picture of what we're working on, and would love to have you join us in working on this. I've got a small community that talks about these kinds of things. It talks about how do we get better at this stuff. And we're all practitioners, not many academics. This is not a strong academic field for reasons that I can't understand. But we're working on it, and we're trying to develop new ways and new things. So we'd love to have you become a part of that. If you'd like to do that, just join the conversation. Reach out to me via email. I'm Larry at dobusywrite.com. If you want to find out more foundational material about what this thinking is and how people that are in our community think about these problems, then you're welcome to explore the podcast, which is also there at dobusywrite.com, and it's available on all the players. And that's where I'm exploring these topics and really the motivation for these topics. And that's how you found me today. So there are a bunch of other episodes, so feel free. Finally, if you'd like to connect with me otherwise, then I'm not hard to find. I'm on LinkedIn, which I think is another great knowledge worker and personal information management toolkit. So it's all part of the same thing. It gets really fractal at some point. So feel free to reach out to me and connect. And we'll think about what is this system that needs to be put in place so that each of us can be more productive in our knowledge work and thus be a part of driving our economy forward into a new level of efficiency and productivity as we grow in our own careers and in our own work. I'd love to have you on board with that. If you'd like to grow and you like to change and like to get better at things, then this is a great community for you to join. So I'll look forward to hearing from you when you get the opportunity. Love for you to learn from the podcast how to get out there and do busy right. And I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.